We're about to start the Chaf Amid Beis on the bottom, the last line. V'chein Omer Rav Chiya u'panav lo nechleku Rabbi Dosa v'chachamim al machzolos shel Usha. In a place called Usha, it's clear that those machzolos, according to everybody, were designated for shchiva, for sleeping purposes, shein tmeos, and therefore they are subject and susceptible to tumas medjus of a zav. On the other extreme, the shel Tveria, the machzolos of Tveria, there's no machlokas about that either, because universally hein tahoros. Those were very tough. They produced and manufactured their mats that were very hard. It was not comfortable for sleeping purposes, and therefore it's not a bed, it's not subject to tumas medjus of a zav. Alman nechleku. So where is the battleground between Rabbi Dosa and Chacham? Al machzolos shar makomos, all other cities, all the locations. And Rashi explains that in all these other locations, it was the exception to the rule, the rare minority, what we call today in the modern parlance, the silent minority, or maybe not so silent minority. They were designated for yeshiva. And Marsav Rav Dosa said that Keva Deleka the Yosef Alayim, there's virtually no one. I mean, your average, Joe is not going to sleep on the machzolos in all these cities. And therefore, Hidden Tveria Damya, they have the same status as the mats in Tveria. They're not considered designated for sleeping. They're not makabel tumas medjus. Umar Savar, but the Chachamim disagree. Kevan de Mikri. Mikri means it happens, right? We watch a Mikra. V'yasme, they sit alayu on them. So even though, generally speaking, they don't designate it specifically for reclining and sleeping, but nevertheless, on occasion, they use it for such. In the Ucha Damyan, we're going to compare the machzolos in the world, Sefer Tveria, to the machzolos of Usha, and it's considered as if it was designated for shchiva, and therefore it's makabel tumas medjus. So we see clearly that Reish Lakish understood that the machlokas between Rabbi Dosa and the Chachamim revolved around the case of machzolos, not that case of that leather bag that we spoke about earlier, as to whether or not these are susceptible to tumas medjus. And now the Gemara is going to go back to the words of Rabbi Dosa, the position of Rabbi Dosa that we quoted earlier based on a Mishnah in Edios, and the Gemara is going to attack that tradition, that transmission. Omar Mar, we quoted Rabbi Dosa, Kol achot solos v'tabit tu b'tzves, Rabbi Dosa, meaning that these solos, which according to Reish Lakish are machatzolos, can be makabel tumas mes, meaning they have a shame kli, not tumas medjus, because Rabbi Dosa, as we saw before, goes past a rov, he looks at rov p'nei adam. We'll scratch that sentence. We'll come back to that in a minute. In any event, Vasanya, what about the following brayso? Rabbi Dosa Omer Kidvarov, he agreed with Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi that you can use machzolos for schach. Again, what kind of machzolos are we talking about? And he wants to use it for schach. It's a machzelos ketana, and it's aruga. Aruga means it's woven. So it would seem that once it's woven, it's already tough and it's not comfortable to sleep on, and it's not royal kabel tumah, and therefore it's kosher for schach.
Now, I said before that aruga is and the braiding no.
Correct, and now we have a brisa that Rabbi Dosa accepts Rabbi Shmuel. Let's go back and look at Rabbi Shmuel again. If you remember back on Daf Chaf Amud Aleph, and this would be, let's say, approximately 20 lines up, maybe 15 lines up. The first one of the line is Yishmael. Do you see that? Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi, Achazu v'achazu Masechachim ba. Meaning, even if it's aruga, according to Rabbi Yishmael, then you could use it for schach. It's already tough enough that you wouldn't find it comfortable as a bed, and rather you would designate it, unless we know otherwise, as schach. And now we have a brisa that identifies Rabbi Dosa with Rabbi Yishmael, and that's not a shock to us. But what's problematic now is how do you square that with the fact that Rabbi Dosa himself is quoted in the Mishnah in Edios as holding, maintaining the position that machatzolos are metavim tumas mes, which means it has the status of a kli. If it has the status of a kli, it must be designated for a function. It's not designated for schach. And once it has the status of a kli, by definition, it's disqualified as schach. How do we reconcile this? Lo kasha, or the it's like gedanfa, or the less like gedanfa. Here's where good knowledge of Aramaic could come in handy. But gedanfa is an outside lid. And what happens is that sometimes the real sophisticated manufacturers would manufacture a mat which wasn't just flat, but it had a lip around it. And once it had a lip around it, then you could use it as a receptacle. For example, you would store fruits. He writes, Asuyos l'kabel b'tochen peiros. So once you put peiros in there, it becomes like a basket. And that's why Rabbi Dosa says that's makabel tulas mes. It has the status of a kli. But hadalesli genan for the brisa is talking about a machzeles that is absolutely flat. It doesn't have a rim around it, and therefore you can't use it as a basket. If you put, let's say, oranges in it, the oranges will be all over the place. And therefore we designate it as schach, something that we cover in oil. And therefore Rabbi Dosa holds that it's not called a kli, and therefore could be used as schach. Now in the Mishnah, Rabbi Dosa was of the opinion that chatzalos are a kli, and therefore they're susceptible to tumas mes, but they're not used normally for shchiva, and therefore they are not susceptible to tumas medrus. And we had a machlokus between Rav Dimi and Rav Reish Lakish about what this chotzeles is. And now the Gemara is going to really analyze this, this machlokus between Rav Avdimi. He identified as leather bags, if you remember, like the couch, and Reish Lakish said it was just a mat. Basically, Gemara now asks from a brisa, chotzolos shel sha'am v'shel gemi v'shel sak v'shel sfira mitame tumas mes. Divrei Rabbi Dosa. Okay, so this is the Rabbi Dosa that we're familiar with. And now we have an enumerated list in this brisa of all sorts of cases of chotzolos. What's common to all of them is that they have the status of a kli. And the Chachamim went a step further, not only the status of a kli, but the status of a bed, of reclining, of medrus. So we have sha'am, and I looked up the English. He says it's a rush plant. Again, it's from that same family of plants that grow in the marshland, where it's very wet. And those are called gemi. Then we have a certain utensil, which is called sak, that's made of goat feathers. Then we have a kli that's made of the hairs on the neck. I need a better word. The neck of a horse. What's the neck of a horse called? There's an English word for it. Anyway,
the hair is called the mane.
Mane, and the neck is called the neck. So we're talking about sphira is made of the mane of a horse. The horse. Also,
the goat's hair.
Well, he says here it's the goat's feathers. They actually have feathers. I don't know, notos. That's what he says in the Hebrew. Let's see what he says.
Where did it say that?
That's here in my Hebrew. Let's see what he says in the English. Oh, he says goat's hair. You're right.
Yeah.
It doesn't say. Okay, so I guess notos maybe. I always translate notos as feathers, but I guess in this context it means hair. And sphera could be the hair of the neck of the horse or from its tail. They actually made kalim out of the hairs of the tail of a horse tail.
Yeah.
And in all these cases, according to Rabbi Dosa, it's not used for sleeping purposes, but it's definitely a kli, it's a receptacle, and therefore it's makabel tumas mes. According to Rav Dimi, that a chotzeles is a leather bag that's used by the shepherds. Then I understand Rabbi Dosa, who says that all these different kinds of chotzeles are considered a kli because it's makabel tumah, a kli, and therefore it's makabel tumah because it's a bag, it's a leather bag. Shel shav, shel gemi. They're not woven, but at least they have holes in them, and they're considered a kli. Why is it a kli if it has holes in it? I mean, what's going to stay within it? Chazu means it's raw, it's fit for kinsa de peri. You can make a basket for large fruits. The large fruits will not fall in between the cracks. Now, when we get to these bags that we mentioned before, shel sak, shel sphira, here they do a very good job of weaving it, with those hairs, and it's considered a kli. What does it use for? These long patches and sacks. They can be used as pouches or as sacks, as we said before. A sack. You know what I mean by a sack, right? So in other words, since you could make a sack like this, then you could put, little fruits inside of it, or different kinds of legumes and so forth and so on. But in any event, it has a status of a kli, and therefore Rabbi Dosa says that chotzolos are reuyos l'kabel tu. So that's fine according to Rabbi Avdimi. Elo l'mandir, but according to Reish Lakish, mach solos mamish, he identifies chotzeles with mats, and mats have no kli kibul, base kibul. They are flat. There's no receptacle. So why are they makabel tumah? How could Rabbi Dosa say that if they're together with a corpse in the same oil, they contract tumah? Bishlei mishal sak mishal sphira, where they have, as we said before, a very fine and successful weaving process. I can understand Rabbi Dosa, the chazu leparse, that you can use them as a curtain or nafvasa. There's such small holes because of the very fine embroidery that you could use it as a sieve, sieve. And we sift our flour to make sure that we get all the little pebbles out. Elishal Shamishal Gemi, these are very holy. I don't mean holy, sanctified. I mean holy means they're full of holes. And if you put legumes and small fruits inside, it's going to fall right through the holes. Is Lamai Chazu? What function could they actually accomplish? More answers Chazu legaz yasa. Gaz yasa in Hebrew is called a gigit. Gigit is a large vat, and they were used for shecha. You put the hops in and the barley and so forth, the barley hops, and then you add whatever liquids you add, and then you get beer. And they used to use these machzolos, these mats that were made of all these kinds of reeds and moist, vegetation. They would use it to cover the vats, the brewing vats. Therefore, it's royal kabbalah. Ika diamri. Now we have another lishna, and the kasha is being asked in a different way. Bishlei v'lamandi omar machzolos mamish. According to Reish Lakish, I understand that if chotzeles means machzolos, I understand Rabbi Dosa very well, that all these different types, enumerated types of chotzelos made of different materials, are royal kabel tumas mes. even though you don't sleep on them. And we'll go through them again. Shel Shab, Shel Gemi, Chazul Gas Yosef, Shel Sak, Shel Spira, Chazul Parse, Benafvasa. Each one has its own function. He says curtains and sieves and pouches and sacks, or to cover brewing vats. Elamadi Omer Marzovle, but according to Rabbi Abdivi, that a chotzeles is a leather bag that's worn by the shepherd. Bishle v'shel sak v'shel spira, that there is a very fine weaving. Now I understand Rabbi Dosa, that it's Mekabel Tuma Dechazi Ligulki Vitzini. It can be used as pouches and sacks for the larger fruits. Ela Shel Sham Shel Gemi, which are not subject to a very fine embroidery and weaving. And it has holes, such that fruits will fall through the holes. It's a my chazi. What function can they have? Why they royal Kabel Tuma? Morantzis the chazi lekinsa. The peri. You can use these kinds of bags as a basket for fruits. Again, we're talking about larger fruits, and they will not fall through the cracks. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Rav Chananya, Sharadati Legolah. When I went from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz, and this has to do with a Gemara in Masechet Brachos that Rav Chananya lived in Eretz Yisrael, but he would go down to Chutz La'aretz to be Ma'aber the Shana, which means to add an extra month of Adar. Matzasi Zaken Echad. I found an elderly Jew, and he was apparently a reliable scholar. The Amar he said to me, Misachachim bibudya. Budya is another word for a mat, a machzeles. We could use it for schach. Ukshebasi eitzel Rabbi Yoshua chi'ava. When I came to my uncle Rabbi Yoshua, hodol dvarav, he accepted and confirmed that this is indeed the halacha, like that zakeh. Rav Chizda, v'hu de Leslie Gadanfa. You could only use a mat as schach because it's not makabel too. It doesn't have a shem kli because it doesn't have a rim around it. If it has a rim around it, then it becomes a base kibul and it's a receptacle. You can put fruits in. It's like a basket. It's makabel tuma and it's possible to schach. Omar Ula Hani budyasa dibnei mechonsa. The mats of the people living in a city called Machosa, il male here shalahem misachim. If not for the fact that they have a kier is literally a wall, but what it means in this context is it has a rim around it. And if it didn't have a rim around it, we could use it for schach. But unfortunately, they produced mats that had a rim around it, and therefore it was disqualified for schach. We learned like that in Brisa. Mesachim bebudya. We can use these mats but in Yeshem Kier, if they have this kind of a rim, a lip around them, ain mesachim, we cannot use them because they're a kli and they're royal kabel tuma, and therefore they're disqualified for schach. Hadron Olecha Perik Rishon, the first chapter of Masechet Sukkah. Now we'll just start quickly the second chapter of Masechet Sukkah.
Question about they manufacture stuff or anywhere. Stuff they have to designate it for stuff. Say or any.
If it's something that everybody buys in stock and it has no other function, they don't have to designate. But when it's something that has an alternative function, it could be a mat, it could be today we use mats, as a kind of an area rug almost. That would be a problem if you want to use such a mat, unless you produced it and specifically designated as schach. Hayoshem tachas hamita b'sukkah. What would you say about this? He sleeps underneath a bed. Apparently, it was a very crowded sukkah. They didn't have enough room. So he went to sleep underneath the bed. And here the Mishnah records a machlokas. According to Tanakama, lo yotza yidei chovasa. He has not fulfilled his mitzvah because he's not sleeping in the sukkah. It means he is sleeping under a bed, and the bed is called an oel, and he's sleeping in an oel. The oel happens to be by chance located in the sukkah, but he's sleeping in the oel. He's not sleeping in the sukkah, and therefore he's not yotzei the mitzvah of yeshiva b'sukkah. But Omer Rabbi Yehuda, I'm going to prove to you that that's not so. Noagim hayinu shayinu yeshenim tachas hamitu b'fnei askenim. I remember in my youth we would sleep under the bed, and it was in the presence of the elders. They didn't raise even a peep, a voice of protest. Their silence indicates what we call shtika kota, that they approve.
That's considered a proof. Yeah.
I think so. If the person who is sleeping on the bed is obligated the mitzvah of sukkah, later on we'll see that if it was a child or a woman who's not obligated, but if you're obligated the mitzvah of sukkah, then the chacham cannot tolerate that. They have to object, because if they don't object, then silence equals approval. Now, what would make sense here? Why would this not be considered sleeping in an oel rather than sleeping in a sukkah? Well, how can he fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah? The answer is that this is complicated, but there are two dinim of aroi. Aroi means temporary. There's the sukkah itself could be aroi, or it could be that I'm sleeping in a way that's aroi. So even though I'm sleeping under an oel, but that's not my permanent way of sleeping. That's not like I'm sleeping under an oel. It happens to be that there's an oel on top of my body, but I'm not sleeping in the oel. You follow what I mean? If you go to sleep inside an oel and the oel protects you, and you need that protection, then you can't say that you yoked in the midst of sukkah. But if you're just on a temporary basis, you crawl under the bed, but you're not really expecting the bed to give you shelter, that's not called sleeping in an oel. It's you're sleeping in a bed. Oh, now this is to answer your question, man. Here's a case of someone who slept under the bed, but it's not that person has the status of a woman, and therefore he's not obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah. Who is that? That's an eved. And an eved, based on a famous Gesera called La each has the same status in mitzvahs as a woman, and he's exempt from time-bound mitzvahs. Now, this guy Tevi is quoted very often in the Mishnah. He was Rabbi Gamliel's famous eved. He was quite a scholar in his own right. But Yoshe Tachas Hamita. The Amar Lehem, Rabbi Gamliel is Kedim, Re'isem Tevi Avdi. Look what a scholar he is. I get the impression, I don't know, I'm not sure if I'm right, I'll do a little more research, that he wanted to demonstrate that there is no obligation to sleep in a sukkah because he's an eved. And he has the same status in Ishi's part of mitzvah seishman grama. So he went out of his way to demonstrate that he's not obligated in the mitzvah of sukkah, to make a statement. That's how a Talmid Chacham does it. Lefi darkeinu lamadnu. And therefore, based on this story, we should derive the conclusion, like the Chachamim, the Tanakhama of our Mishnah, Shayotchim Tachas Hamita lo yotzu yidei chavos. He has not fulfilled his obligation. That's why Tevi Avdi would sleep under the bed. Gemara asks the following kasha: well, leka asora. I don't understand the Tanakhama and Reb Shimon. They both agree that if you sleep under a bed, then you're not sleeping under the sukkah because you're inside an oel. You're sleeping in an oel. But wait a second. Under the bed, there are presumably, again, we're going to change our mind, but presumably it doesn't have a height, between the ground and the bottom, the underside of the bed. It's not 10 tefachim high. 10 tefachim would be like this. What kind of bed is 10 tefachim high? Unless you have a very fancy bed.
That's not considered no help.
So that's a problem. See, this is a kind of a perfect example of something that's not for daf yomi. Is it an oel? Is not an oel. An oel, as Mendel points out very well, only requires one tefach. Why is the Gemara assuming that if it's not 10 tefachim high, then it's not an OL? That's not true. This whole Gemara is a Pella, and I want you to know, I did a little research, and at the end of the day, there's no answer to this question. The Rishonim have a problem. What they basically say is that the issue here is not really the issue of OL, but rather are you in a separate compartment, so to speak, and you've sort of separated yourself from a sukkah. If you have the comfort of a space, when you go to sleep under the bed that's 10 tefachim high, then we deem it as if you're in an area that's distinct from the sukkah. You've, so to speak, removed yourself from a sukkah. Again, even though the minimum height of an ol is 1 tefach, not 10 tefachim, the question here is always better than the answer. So Shmuel said we have to interpret that Mishnah that the reason why he's not Yotze is because he's got 10 tefachim of height. Now, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda holds that we don't see this as if he's sleeping in an ol. If he sleeps under a bed, then he's Yotze the mitzvah. Meaning, this is not an ol. Underneath a bed, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is not sleeping inside an ol. He's sleeping in the sukkah, and therefore he's Yotze the sukkah. And the Gemara says, wait a second. Tanan Hassam, we have a Mishnah Masechet Olos. Now, we don't have time to go through all the nitty-gritties of this Mishnah, but the bottom line of this Mishnah is that an OL is only an OL if it's humanly created. There are many situations in nature where a cavity is created. Like, for example, we have something called chur shecharu mayim. You have a flow of water constantly until it digs out a hole. Or shrutzim, you have animals that burrow their way and they create openings and cavities. Or achalaso malachas, where you could have corrosion because of various minerals. You have to know a lot about physics for this. Or midbach avonim, you could have sometimes boulders that are piled up one on the other, and if they fall, they create a cavity because of their sheer weight. Or he has a case of a svar shel koros. He has a hollow or a cavity that's created by a stack of beams, heavy beams. And in all these cases, Rabbi Yehuda is going to tell us that it's not an oil. And if you had a corpse inside this naturally made cavity, it's not a human man-made cavity, then it would not convey tumah. It doesn't have the status of an oil. And the Tanakama says, Mahil ala tumah. It has the status of an oil. For Rabbi Yehuda Omer kol oil she'eno asui b'dei adam eno oil. An oil, for purposes of tumah, he's going to derive this from Gzeira Shava, has to be a humanly man-made created oil. And it's created for the purpose of shelter. Like time in Rabbi Yehuda, and here we have the Gzeira Shava of Rabbi Yehuda on the top of Chaf Aleph. Amen. Aleph Yoliv Oel Mi Mishkan. Now this is a pretty complicated Gzeira Shava, and the Chachamim will be challenged by this Gzeira Shava. They'll reinterpret the Gzeira Shava, and that we'll see in Mirza Hashem tomorrow.
Are you going to teach on Zoom 30 or later?
B'li neder, if I can, tomorrow I'll teach on Zoom.